So welcome to another episode of Jeff Smith's Garage. This time I thought we'd do a few tech tips for you. Anybody who wrenches on cars, it's always a matter of little details. Sometimes it can trip you up and make life difficult or whatever, or with a little tip, make life a little easier. So we've got a few ideas here we thought we'd throw out at you. Okay, so this little tip actually happened to me. I have a V8 S10 conversion I did several years ago, and we pulled the original fuel pump out of the tank, and all I did was replace the pump. And at the same time, I used just a chunk of aluminum or regular rubber fuel line between the pump and the rest of the fixture. And then a couple of years later, the thing started running poorly, and it ran progressively worse until I finally took it apart, figuring that the pump had somehow gone bad. And what it turned out to be was, because I had used a chunk of regular rubber fuel line, that's what came out of the pump. It literally disintegrated because it's not submersible style rubber fuel line. I didn't know that. So the key here is to use a submersible style of hose. Now in this particular Holley conversion kit, for example, they use a hard plastic line that is impervious to gasoline, so it will never deteriorate, which is why they use this stuff. It's very thick, heavy, hard to cut. It's hard to put this fitting on there. It's all for a reason, because it actually works much better. So the key is to use, if you're going to use a chunk of regular rubber fuel line, make sure it's submersible. It will say it right on the rubber itself. Like this is, for example, is Earl's Vapor Guard hose, which is good rubber hose to use on the outside of the engine, but is not submersible. So again, the key is don't run into a problem like that, because it's very hard to figure out what the problem is till you take it all apart. Okay, we ran into this situation with doing a head swap on an LS motor out at Westech. Steve Brule and I were working on this engine, and ran into a situation where he was torquing the head bolts on one side and was going to hand me the wrench, and I was going to do my side. And he says, this one bolt doesn't feel right. It feels hinky. And I said, okay, where are you at? Where we're at 50, stop there. And then on my side, felt the same thing, where you pull on the head bolt and it's tight, and all of a sudden it feels like it lets go. And I ran into the same situation. So we went ahead and ran the engine. The test ran fine and everything, and I came home and I talked to the guys at ARP, and this is what I discovered, is that the Spotface operation that the late model engines all use now has become very, very good. So it becomes a very smooth surface. And so what happens is, and then combined that with a slight change that ARP did to actually make their washers even smoother. So that combination, what happened was, when you put this stud in the engine, that it actually will, if you have, especially if you have lube underneath the washer, between the washer and the head, it actually will rotate and act like a bearing. When that happens, all that additional friction that should have been applied to the torque spec now goes into stretching the bolt. And what'll happen is it'll either pull the bolt or the stud apart, or usually what'll happen is it rips the threads out of the block, neither of which is good. So the solution is very, very simple. All you need to do is make sure that the surface on the head and the bottom of the washer, between the washer and the head, is as clean as possible. And then in this case, you just take it, put it on some 60 grit sandpaper, and sand it for about 3 or 4 strokes. And in essence, it makes the bottom of the washer, it has some teeth to it now. It has a little bit of grit to it. Clean that off, throw that on there, run the stud on there, tighten it down, and then you put your lube between the bottom of the nut and the top of the washer. And that allows you to set the torque. So it's a simple process. So in the case of that engine on the dyno, I brought it home, took it all back apart, just took the studs out, or the bolts out, cleaned the washers on both sides, ran the sandpaper technique, and it torqued right up and it was perfect. So it doesn't usually happen on older engines, because the spot face on those engines is pretty rough, so it never happens. But in the late model engine, it's a very common situation. So if you're building LS motors, it's something to keep in mind. So let's talk about a little unknown product. You know, nobody pays attention to distributor gears, but if you swap camshafts a lot like we do doing stories for the magazines and stuff, that what we've run into before is with certain camshafts, if it's a steel camshaft, this is an iron cam, but if it was a steel camshaft, it would have a steel gear. And in the past, the cam companies have always told you you have to run a bronze gear. Well, the problem with running a bronze gear on the street is the bronze is much softer than the steel gear, and it's just going to eat the gear up, and in a matter of a couple thousand miles, you've got to pull the distributor out and change the gear. It gets to be a hassle. So the smart move is, and this is what I've discovered from doing some research with help from the guys at Comp Cams, is there's a lot of misinformation about distributor gears out there. So the key is to use something called a melonized gear. Now on a GM style gear, their hydraulic roller cars, engines, when they were still using distributors, they would use a melonized gear on a steel factory gear, and it worked really, really well, no problems. It's a metal treatment process that essentially it's a heat treating process. So how do you identify a melonized gear? Well, if you look, and we'll do a tight shot to show you, but if we compare these side by side, the melonized gear has this mottled finish on it, and the normal iron gear does not. And so that will show you that that shows you what the melonized gear is. So if you've got one laying around, you're not sure, that's one way to identify it. So the key is a melonized gear will work with any camshaft, flat tappet, hydraulic, flat tappet, mechanical, all the hydraulic rollers, all the solid rollers, even the 8620 steel billet gears, all that kind of stuff, those cams, this gear will work for all of them. So if you've got lots of engines and you're not sure what cam is in it, that's a good way to go about doing it. Now, one other little quick tip is for MSD distributors, they use a 0.500 half-inch distributor shaft. The factory gears, or the factory distributors rather, use a 491. So it's a different gear for an MSD distributor versus a normal GM distributor. So let's talk a little bit about clutches and flywheels for a bunch of different applications. So let's start with the early stuff first. This is a small block Chevy type of package from Centerforce. And in the early engines, well, first let's tell you about the pieces. So this is obviously a pressure plate. So this, when you push on the clutch, on the release bearing, that releases the pressure pushing down on the plate against the clutch, and it releases the clutch from the flywheel. This is your pressure plate surface here. This is your basic dual friction disc, and then flywheel. Now, the pressure plate is actually located and centered on the flywheel using these bolts with a very special shouldered area. You must use these bolts, and they actually come with your clutch assembly when you buy it from any manufacturer generally, but if they don't, you need to make sure and have this type of bolt, because if you don't, this shoulder is what actually locates the pressure plate on the flywheel. If you don't have it, if you use a regular bolt, it allows the pressure plate to move around slightly. Now you've got a vibration and you don't know where it came from. So on late model engines, they do it a little bit different. So this is off of an LS engine, and same thing, pressure plate, clutch disc. The difference is that, and you can see it, there are 3 pins on the flywheel, and these pins locate holes on the pressure plate, and that centers the pressure plate on the flywheel, and that's what keeps it from vibrating. So there's actually a situation where you could use one of these pressure plates on an LS. The pattern is the same. The problem is that there's no provision for the pins. I've seen people pull these pins out, drill these holes out, and then just use the regular metric bolt. And will it work? Yes. Is it right? No, because now the pressure plate is no longer centered on the flywheel. You get a vibration, 6,000 RPM, it could be a serious vibration, and you won't know where it comes from. And searching it might be difficult because you're making all kinds of assumptions that it's centered when it really isn't. So the other next little tip is, whenever you're assembling these things with the new stuff, you'll see, like Centerforce, for example, it'll say on here, flywheel side. The flywheel side always, you can see there's the springs on this side. These are the sprung hub on every street disc. This shallow side always goes towards the engine. The deep side always goes through the pressure plate. In this particular case, on the early stuff especially, you can look, this disc will actually sit flat in this flywheel. The only reason it does is because the bolts aren't in this particular situation. But on the engine, if you inadvertently throw it in here incorrectly, the clutch will not release because it will hang up on the flywheel bolts. So the key is always remember the sprung hub comes to the top side. So as you're assembling these things, always make sure and clean these surfaces with both the flywheel and the pressure plate, or the pressure plate with brake clean. You don't want greasy thumbprints all over these friction surfaces because that will create the clutch disc that will glaze, and then it'll chatter and you won't know why. So the final little tip is to flywheel bolts. You oftentimes, especially the early Chevy stuff, will come with these little tiny star washers. They came from the factory that way. Don't use these. ARP will tell you do not use these because what happens is they split and then it unloads the fastener and you lose your torque. So the key is to get rid of those star washers, throw them away. That way you're not tempted to use them again. And then just use a little Loctite on the threads, torque it down in the proper pattern, and you're ready to go. So you combine all those little tips and you've got a nice package for your manual transmission application. Okay, so let's talk about the Chevrolet small block Vortex cylinder head. Everybody knows that this is a great application for a mild street engine. It's got a 64cc chamber, will pump the compression up a little bit, but there's a trick involved with choosing the right spark plug. So when they modified this cylinder, when they redesigned it, they actually increased the thread pitch, the thread length. So this is a standard small block Chevy tapered seat 490 reach spark plug, but you can see that the Vortex spark plug is significantly longer. And that's important because if you look in the chamber here, we put this short reach spark plug in here and it doesn't even protrude past the ends of the threads. So that shrouds the spark and that's just going to kill performance. I mean, the engine will just barely run. As opposed to down here in this chamber, you can see that the correct application spark plug is there and that's where it's supposed to be positioned. And if you really want to get serious, you'll actually index this to try and get this so that the opening of the spark plug is pointing towards the piston. But the key to this is really the selection of the proper spark plug. And it turns out that the same spark plug for the Vortex head is also used on the late model LS engines as well. So it's a nice little tip. You make sure and choose the right spark plug and your engine will run a lot better. So hopefully you learned something from one of these tech tips. If so, we're going to bring more information like that. So, ring the bell, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll keep cranking out Just Miss Garage videos.